I'm Isola Raye, 22 years old. Until 3 months ago, I believed that if you worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and waited patiently enough, people would eventually show up for you. Then my father chose a vacation in Bali over my college graduation, and everything I thought I knew about family crumbled like old paper. The text came at 6 in the morning. So sorry, sweetheart. Sophia booked this trip months ago and we can't cancel. So proud of you. We'll celebrate when we get back. Love, Dad. 22 years of straight A's, scholarships, and making myself small enough to fit into his sporadic attention. And I got a text message with a crying, laughing emoji, my mother's. Words from that morning still echo in my mind. Some people show up, Isola. Others just show off. What he didn't know was that I had been saving money from my campus job for 3 years to buy him a watch for graduation day. What would you do if the person you spent your whole life trying to impress forgot you existed? Before we jump back, and tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of my graduation, I woke up in the apartment I shared with my best friend, Avery, in the University District of Seattle. Rain drummed against our window's typical Pacific Northwest spring weather that made everything feel both cleansed and melancholy. I'd been awake since 5, not because of nerves about the ceremony, but because of something else entirely. And expectation that had been building for 4 years. I was going to be the first person in my family to graduate from college. My mother, Carmen, had dropped out of community college when she got pregnant with me. My father, Gabriel, had a business degree, but from a family that took higher education for granted. For me, this diploma represented something different, proof that I could finish what I started, that I could make something of myself worthy of. Attention. The apartment smelled like coffee and the lavender candles Avery was obsessed with. She was already up, sitting cross-legged on our second-hand couch with her laptop balanced on her knees, probably working on her thesis defense presentation for next week. Avery was getting her master's in social work, and she approached everything in life with the same methodical intensity she brought to her studies. "Morning, graduate," she said without looking up from her screen. "You ready for today?" I padded to the kitchen and started making coffee in our temperamental French press. The ritual of grinding beans and timing the steep always calmed me. I think so. Mom's coming early to help me get ready, and Dad said he'd meet us at the ceremony. That was a lie, actually. Dad hadn't confirmed anything specific. Our last conversation 3 days ago had been typically vague. "Of course I'll be there, sweetheart. Wouldn't miss it for the world." But Gabriel Morales had a talent for making promises that sounded concrete but dissolved under scrutiny. Avery finally looked up, her dark eyes sharp with a particular brand. A protective skepticism she reserved for conversations about my father. "Has he called to confirm details?" "He'll be there," I said, maybe trying to convince myself as much as her. She didn't push, but I could feel her concern settling over the room like a fine mist. Avery had grown up with 2 fathers who showed up to every soccer game, every school, play every minor milestone. She couldn't quite understand my relationship with Gabriel, the way I clung to his sporadic attention. Like sunlight breaking through clouds, my phone buzzed on the counter. For a split second, my heart lifted, thinking, it might be Dad calling to coordinate plans. Instead, it was a text from my mother. "On my way with your surprise. Can't wait to see my graduate today. Love you, Mia." Carmen never made promises she couldn't keep. She'd been working double shifts at the hospital for months, saving up for something special for my graduation day. I suspected she'd bought me a piece of jewelry, maybe the pearl earrings I'd admired in a shop window last Christmas. She had a way of noticing the small things I wanted but never asked for. I showered and spent longer than usual getting ready. I wanted to look perfect, today worthy of celebration. My cap and gown hung on the back of my door, pressed and ready. The mortarboard felt heavier than I'd expected when I tried it on, not just the weight of the fabric, but the weight of everything it represented. I thought about the path that had led me here. Growing up in a small apartment with Carmen after. The divorce, learning to be grateful for generic cereal and thrift store clothes. Staying up late to help Mom with her English homework when she decided to go back to school part-time. Watching her sacrifice her own dreams piece by piece to make sure I could pursue my dot, and always, in the background, the phantom presence of my father. Gabriel had left when I was 12, trading our cramped but warm home for a sleek downtown condo and a new life that seemed to have limited space for his old one. The visits became less frequent, the phone calls shorter, the promises more elaborate but less reliable. But college had changed things, I told myself. Gabriel had been proud when I got into the University of Washington. He'd even helped with some of the tuition, though never as much as he initially promised. He'd started introducing me to his colleagues as my daughter, the English major with a pride that felt both genuine and performative. Today was supposed to be different. Today, I was going to walk across that stage and prove that all those years of feeling like I wasn't quite enough had been worth it. Today, Gabriel would see what his daughter had accomplished and maybe, finally, decide I was worth consistent attention. Carmen arrived at 9 with a garment bag and a smile so bright it could have powered the city. She was wearing the navy dress she reserved for special occasions, her graying hair styled in soft waves. At 49, my mother was still beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with makeup or fashion and everything to do with the kindness that seemed to radiate from her skin. "Mia," she said, pulling me into one of her encompassing hugs, "I can't believe this day is finally here." She unzipped the garment bag to reveal a vintage dress, emerald green silk with delicate beading around the neckline. It was clearly expensive, clearly special, and clearly something she couldn't afford. "Mom," I breathed, running my fingers over the fabric. "This is gorgeous, but how did you—" "I've been saving for 2 years," she said simply. "I wanted you to have something beautiful for your special day. Something that makes you feel as proud as I am of you." I tried it on and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for me. In the mirror, I looked older, more sophisticated, like someone who belonged at a college graduation, someone whose achievements mattered. "You look like a queen," Avery said from the doorway, and for the first time that morning, I felt like maybe I was enough exactly as I was. We took pictures in our apartment, me in the dress, me in my cap and gown, me with Carmen, me with Avery. My phone stayed silent, but I kept checking. But anyway, waiting for Gabriel's call or text with details about when and where we'd meet by 10:30. We needed to leave for campus. The ceremony started at noon, and graduates were supposed to check in by 11. I sent Dad a text, heading to campus now. "The ceremony starts at noon in the main quad. Can't wait to see you there." 3 little dots appeared immediately, showing. He was typing, then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared. My stomach started to tighten. "He's probably just driving," I told Carmen, who was watching me stare at my phone with growing concern. "Of course, Mia, he'll be there." But even Carmen's voice carried a note of uncertainty now. She knew Gabriel's patterns as well as I did. The grand gestures followed by inexplicable absences. The enthusiasm that faded when actual effort was required. We gathered my things and headed out into the drizzly Seattle morning. The campus was buzzing with families and graduates, everyone dressed in their finest clothes despite the weather. Vendors were selling flowers and balloons. Parents were snapping endless photos. The energy was infectious and bittersweet all. Of us marking the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. I kept checking my phone as we walked across campus. Still nothing from Gabriel. Maybe his flight was delayed. I said to no one in particular. Flight? Avery asked. I realized I never actually confirmed whether Gabriel was flying in or driving from his condo downtown. I just assumed he'd need to make special arrangements because this was a special day. The check-in process was smooth and quick. I found my place in the alphabetical lineup of graduates and exchanged nervous small talk with classmates I'd known for 4 years, but would probably never see again after today. Everyone seemed to have elaborate post-graduation plans, jobs lined up, graduate school starting in the fall, gap years filled with travel and adventure. I had a job at a local nonprofit starting in 2 weeks, and a tentative plan to move back in with Carmen until I could save enough for my own place. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. Purposeful dot at 11:45. Families began taking their seats in the folding chairs arranged in front of the makeshift stage. I spotted Carmen immediately. She'd managed to snag a seat in the third row, perfect for photos. She was sitting alone, my phone in her hand, checking it more frequently than I was checking mine. The coordinators started calling for graduates to line up. This was it. In 15 minutes, I'd walk across that stage and officially become a college graduate. My phone buzzed. I fumbled to unlock it, my hands suddenly clumsy with hope and anxiety. Gabriel's name appeared on the screen. I opened the message, expecting logistics or an apology for running late. Instead, I read, "So sorry, sweetheart. Sophia booked this trip months ago and we can't cancel. So proud of you. We'll celebrate when we get back. Love, Dad." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I read it again. Certain I'd misunderstood something. Trip. Can't cancel. We'll celebrate when we get back. He wasn't coming. He wasn't even in the state. I'd been choosing the perfect outfit and practicing my smile for photos, while Carmen had been working extra shifts to buy me a dress, while I'd been building this day up in my mind as the moment everything would finally click into place. Gabriel had been planning a vacation. The crying laughing emoji at the end felt like a slap. I stood in that lineup of graduates, surrounded by the excited chatter of my classmates and the distant hum of families settling into their seats, holding my phone like it might explode. The message glowed up at me with Gabriel's characteristic casual cruelty wrapped in loving language. So sorry, sweetheart. Sophia booked this trip months ago and we can't cancel. Sophia, his wife of 8 months, who is 15 years younger than him and 16 years younger than my mother. Sophia, who posted Instagram stories from wine tastings and spa days while Carmen worked double shifts to pay for my textbooks. So proud of you. We'll celebrate when we get back. Proud. Celebrate. Words that meant nothing when delivered through a screen while the person speaking them was thousands of miles away, sipping cocktails on a beach in Bali. The crying laughing emoji felt particularly devastating. Like my graduation was amusing. Like his absence was just a funny little mix-up. Instead of the latest in a decades-long pattern of choosing anything and anyone over his daughter. 5 minutes until processional. Called one of the ceremony coordinators. Everyone check your cap placement and make sure your phone is on silent. I quickly screenshotted Gabriel's message, though I wasn't sure why. Evidence, maybe. Proof that this was really happening. Then I shoved my phone into the small purse I was carrying under my gown. The girl next to me in line, Sarah something, from my Victorian literature class, was practically vibrating with excitement. I can't believe we're finally here. My whole family drove up from Portland. Even my great-aunt came. Did you see all those people in the audience?" I nodded and tried to smile, but my face felt like it was made of cardboard. Through the trees that bordered the quad, I could see Carmen in her navy dress, still clutching my phone, still scanning the crowd with hope that was about to be shattered. "My dad couldn't make it," I heard myself say. The words tasted like ash. "Oh no, is he okay?" "He's in Bali." Sarah looked confused, like she was trying to work out whether this was good news or bad news. "Oh, wow, that's exotic, the processional." Music began, pomp and circumstance played by a small brass ensemble. Somehow, the universally recognizable graduation anthem made everything feel more surreal rather than more real. We started moving forward, a slow parade of black gowns and nervous energy. I could see the stage now, decorated with the university's colors and banners. Professors in their regalia sat in a neat row, ready to shake hands and offer congratulations. The university president stood at the podium, preparing to welcome families and deliver the opening remarks. As we filed into our designated seats, I caught sight of Carmen again. She'd lowered my phone and was applauding enthusiastically as the graduates took their places. Her face was radiant with pride and joy, completely unaware that her ex-husband had just delivered the final blow to whatever fragile hope she might have harbored that he'd grown into a better man. The president began her speech about achievement and potential and the bright futures awaiting us. Her words floated over me like background noise. All I could think about was the careful way Carmen had styled her hair this morning, the new dress she'd bought herself for the occasion, the extra shift she'd probably worked last week to afford. The flowers I saw waiting by her purse, she believed in today too. Maybe not in Gabriel. Carmen was too smart for that, but in the idea that today mattered enough that even Gabriel wouldn't mess it up. I thought about calling her over, pulling her aside, telling her what had happened. But the ceremony was starting, and I couldn't bear the thought of watching her face change from joy to disappointment. Not yet. The valedictorian gave a speech about perseverance and community support. She talked about the professors who'd believed in her, the family members who'd sacrificed for her education, the friends who'd celebrated every small victory along the way. Her voice was strong and clear, and every word felt like it was being delivered from a different universe, one where parents showed up and love was consistent and achievements were witnessed by the people who mattered most. We are here today, not just because of our individual efforts, she said, but because of the people who invested in our dreams and stood by us through every challenge. I wanted to laugh, but I was afraid if I started, I might not stop. The name-calling began. Row by row, we stood and filed onto the stage. Each graduate's name was announced clearly, followed by enthusiastic applause from the audience. I watched my classmates cross the stage, shake hands with the dean, receive their diplomas, and pause for photos with proud family members cheering from the audience. My row was called, stood on unsteady legs, and followed my classmates toward the stage. The walk felt eternal and instantaneous all at once. When I reached the steps, I could see Carmen more clearly. She had her phone raised, ready to record my moment. Her smile was so bright it hurt to look at. "Isola Raye," the announcer called. Carmen's cheer rose above the general applause. "That's my daughter," she called out, her voice thick with emotion. I walked across that stage in my green silk dress and my carefully arranged cap, shook hands with the dean, accepted my diploma, and smiled for photos while my heart was breaking in real time. The photographer captured what I'm sure looked like joy and accomplishment. What he actually captured was the moment I realized I'd been waiting my entire life for someone who was never really going to show up. I paused at the edge of the stage and looked out at the audience. Carmen was crying happy tears, still recording. still cheering. And in that moment, I felt something crack open inside me. Not just sadness, but anger. Pure, clean anger. Gabriel was in Bali, posting Instagram stories of infinity pools and couples massages, while the woman who'd raised me alone sat in a folding chair in the drizzle, celebrating an achievement she'd made possible through years of quiet sacrifice. I descended the stage and returned to my seat for the rest of the ceremony. My diploma felt heavier than I'd expected, and not in a good way. It felt like proof of something I'd accomplished completely alone, despite believing for so long that I was working towards something we'd share. After the final speech and the ceremonial turning of the tassels, graduates began finding their families in the crowd. I made my way toward Carmen, who was gathering her things and beaming with pride. "Mia," she called, opening her arms for a hug. "You did it, my college graduate." I fell into her embrace and let myself cry not happy tears, but everything I'd been holding back for the past hour. Carmen rubbed my back and murmured soothing words in Spanish, the same ones she'd used when I was little and had scraped my knee or had a nightmare. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked when my sobs subsided enough for speech. I pulled back and looked at her, this woman who'd given up her own dreams to make mine possible, who'd never missed a school play or parent-teacher conference, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to buy me a dress for a day she knew mattered to me. "Dad's not coming," I said simply. Carmen's face didn't change immediately. She just looked at me with those steady brown eyes that had been my anchor for as long as I could remember. "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed her Gabriel's text. Carmen read it twice, her expression shifting from confusion to disappointment to something harder, a kind of resigned anger that told me she wasn't surprised, just tired. "I'm sorry, Mia," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry." "For what? You didn't do anything wrong." "I'm sorry that this is who your father is. I'm sorry that you keep hoping he'll be different." Carmen had never spoken against Gabriel directly, not even during the divorce proceedings. She'd maintained a careful neutrality that I'd always appreciated, but never fully understood until now. Looking at her face, I realized she'd been protecting me from the truth about Gabriel's character for years. "He booked a vacation during my graduation," I said, the words feeling surreal even as I spoke them. "Months ago, apparently." Carmen nodded slowly. "That sounds like Gabriel. He's always been good at grand gestures and poor at small consistencies." "I saved money for 3 years to buy him a watch," I said, "for today, to thank him for supporting my education." Carmen's eyes filled with tears she was trying not to shed. "Oh, baby." I kept thinking that if I could just achieve enough, accomplish enough, prove that I was worth the effort. I trailed off, finally hearing how ridiculous it sounded. "You were always worth the effort," Carmen said firmly. "His inability to see that is his failing, not yours." We stood there in the thinning crowd of graduates and families, holding each other while I processed the final devastating lesson of my college career. Some people will never show up. No matter how worthy you make yourself of their attention. Avery appeared beside us, still in her own cap and gown from the master's ceremony that had taken place an hour earlier. She took one look at my face and knew immediately what happened. "He didn't come," she said. "It wasn't a question. He's in Bali," I said. "With Sophia. She booked the trip months ago and they couldn't cancel." Avery's expression cycled through several stages of rage, before settling on the particular brand of protective fury she reserved for people who hurt the ones she loved. "I'm going." "To kill him," she said matter-of-factly. "You'll have to get in line," Carmen replied. Despite everything, I almost smiled. These women, my chosen family, were angrier about Gabriel's absence than I was. Their outrage felt like a warm blanket, protective and healing. "Come on," Avery said, linking her arm through mine. "Let's go get lunch. Somewhere expensive. Somewhere with champagne. We're celebrating you today, with or without the people who don't know how to show up." Carmen nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, today's about you, Mia. About what you've accomplished. About the woman you've become." As we walked across campus toward the restaurant district, I thought about the photo I'd seen on Instagram 3 days ago, Gabriel and Sophia at the airport, boarding a plane to Indonesia. He'd captioned it, "Adventure awaits," with a series of palm tree and airplane emojis. He'd known for weeks that he'd be missing my graduation. He'd known when he told me he wouldn't miss it for the world. He'd known when I talked excitedly about the ceremony during our last phone call. He'd known, and he'd chosen to lie rather than have a difficult conversation. That realization hit harder than his absence. The lying, the casual cruelty disguised as love, the emoji that made my pain feel like a joke, but walking between Carmen and Avery, seeing the fierce love in their faces, feeling the weight of my diploma in my bag, I started to understand something else. I graduated despite Gabriel, not because of him. Every late night studying, every scholarship application, every small triumph and setback, I navigated all of it without him. Maybe it was time to stop waiting for him, to witness my life and start living it for myself, telling and preparing. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The restaurant Avery chose was one of those trendy places in Capital Hill where the servers had carefully curated vintage looks, and the menu featured words like artisanal and locally sourced. Under normal circumstances, it would have felt too expensive, too precious for a family celebration. But nothing about this day felt normal anymore. Carmen insisted on ordering champagne despite my protests about the cost. "Today we celebrate. Properly," she said with the kind of quiet determination that had carried us through the lean years after the divorce. "My daughter graduated from college. That deserves the good stuff." We toasted to my achievement, but the bubbles felt flat against my tongue. Everything felt muted, like I was experiencing the day through thick glass. I kept expecting to feel different, accomplished, proud, adult. Instead, I felt hollow, like something essential had been scooped out of me. "Tell me about the job," Carmen said, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward positive territory. "You start in 2 weeks. The crisis center downtown," I confirmed. "Counseling coordination and grant writing. It's not much money, but the work feels important." "It is important," Avery said firmly. "More important than whatever Gabriel does all day in his glass office tower." Carmen shot her a warning look, but Avery shrugged. "What? Someone needs to say it." Isola is about to start a job helping people who've been abandoned and traumatized. Meanwhile, her father abandons her on her graduation day to go Instagram his way through Southeast Asia. The irony's not lost on me. She wasn't wrong. Gabriel worked in corporate consulting, something to do with efficiency optimization for mid-sized companies. I never fully understood what he did, partly because he never really explained it in terms that meant anything to me, and partly because I always suspected it didn't mean much to him either. It was a job that paid well and looked impressive on business cards, but I'd never heard him talk about it with passion or purpose. "I wanted to call him," I admitted, right after I write the text. "I wanted to call and ask him why Sophia's vacation planning mattered more than 4 years of my life. Why didn't you?" Carmen asked gently. "Because I already knew what he'd say. He'd apologize in that smooth way he has, make it sound like a series of unfortunate circumstances instead of a choice. He'd promised to make it up to me with something bigger and better later, and I'd probably believe him because I always do. I thought about the pattern we'd fallen into over the years. Gabriel would disappoint me. I'd be hurt. He'd swoop in with grand gestures and elaborate explanations, and I'd forgive him because the alternative accepting that my father simply didn't prioritize me felt too devastating to consider. Like the time he promised to take me to see Hamilton for my 19th birthday. I told everyone at school, planned my outfit, even bought a new program from a previous production to read beforehand. 2 days before the show, he'd canceled because of a work emergency that turned out to be a golf weekend with clients. 3 weeks later, he'd shown up with expensive concert tickets to see an artist I'd mentioned liking once, and somehow that was supposed to erase the Hamilton, disappointment dot, or the time he promised to help with my college application essays. Something I'd been nervous about for months. We'd scheduled a whole weekend to work on them together. He'd never shown up, claiming a family emergency with Sophia's relatives that I later learned was a wine-tasting trip to Napa, but he'd sent me a check for a college counseling service, which was supposed to be better than his time anyway. Pattern was always the same, disappointing absence followed by expensive compensation, delivered with enough charm and plausible excuses that I'd end up feeling guilty for being upset in the first place. You know what bothers me most? I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. It's not that he chose Sophia's vacation. It's that he lied to me for weeks about planning to be here. Carmen and Avery exchanged a look that told me. They'd been having conversations about Gabriel's behavior probably for years. What? I asked. Nothing, Carmen said quickly. Mom, it's just, we've been worried about this pattern. About how much emotional energy you put into maintaining your relationship with someone who doesn't seem to put in equal effort. Avery nodded. Remember sophomore year when you spent your entire winter break trying to coordinate a visit with him? You rearranged your work schedule, canceled plans with friends, kept 3 different days open because he couldn't commit to a specific time. I remembered. Gabriel had eventually suggested meeting for lunch on my last day of break, which had turned into coffee because he was running late, which had turned into a 20-minute conversation in his car because Sophia had made dinner reservations he couldn't miss. I thought that if I could just be more flexible, more understanding, more accommodating ... I started more perfect. Carmen finished quietly. She was right. I'd been trying to make myself perfect enough to deserve consistent attention from my father. Straight A's, scholarship money that reduced his financial obligation, career plans. That would make him proud to introduce me to his colleagues. I'd been performing my worthiness for years, and he'd still chosen a vacation over my graduation. I found the divorce papers last month, I said suddenly. Both women looked at me with surprise. I was helping you reorganize the filing cabinet. I told Carmen, and I saw them in the bottom drawer. I read through them. Carmen's face had gone very still. My J.A. ... double quote. He fought you on custody, didn't he? You wanted shared custody 50-50 time, and he argued for every other weekend and 1 night per week. Carmen was quiet for a long moment. The lawyers said it was standard negotiating strategy, that he was positioning for better financial terms. But you knew better. I knew your father. I knew that he loved the idea of being a father more than the actual work of parenting. But I hoped he'd grow into it. That having his own place and his own schedule would help him be more present with you. Instead, the opposite had happened. Without the structure of daily family life, Gabriel had drifted further and further from active parenting. He'd become more like a benevolent uncle, someone who appeared occasionally with gifts and stories, but who wasn't involved in the actual texture of my life. I used to make excuses for him, I admitted. Tell myself he was just busy, just adjusting to the new arrangement. Tell myself that quality time mattered more than quantity. Quality time has to actually be quality, Avery pointed out, not just expensive. She was right. Gabriel's visits had often felt performative, like he was checking items off a list rather than genuinely connecting with me. Dinner at a nice restaurant where he'd ask generic questions about school. Movies he'd choose based on what seemed age-appropriate rather than what I actually wanted to see. Shopping trips where he'd buy me things I didn't need to avoid conversations that might get complicated. I think I've been afraid, I said slowly, that if I stopped trying so hard to maintain our relationship, it would just disappear. And maybe it would, Carmen said gently. But honey, what are you actually maintaining? A relationship where you do all the emotional work and he shows up when it's convenient. The words hit like a physical blow, partly because they were true and partly because hearing them out loud made me realize how long I've been lying to myself about the nature of my relationship with Gabriel. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through our text conversation from the past month. The pattern was stark and undeniable. I'd initiated every conversation. I'd asked about his schedule, his work, his plans with Sophia. I'd shared news about graduation preparations, job interviews, apartment hunting. His responses had been brief and generic. That's great, sweetheart. And so proud of you. And can't wait to hear more. But he never asked follow-up questions, never initiated contact, never showed curiosity about the details of my life. I don't think he actually knows me, I said quietly. Like, as a person. He knows that I'm his daughter and that I'm in college and that I'm doing well. But I don't think he knows what I'm interested in or what I worry about or what makes me laugh. Carmen reached across the table and took my hand. That's his loss, Mia. His enormous loss. But it feels like mine too, I admitted. I've spent so much energy trying to be the kind of daughter he'd want to know that I'm not sure I know who I actually am when I'm not performing for him. The admission hung in the air between us. For 22 years, I'd been editing myself to fit into Gabriel's limited attention span, choosing achievements I thought would impress him, suppressing emotions that might inconvenience him, crafting a version of myself that was easy to love from a distance. You know what I realized today? I said, standing on that stage, looking out at all those families. I realized that the person I was looking for in the audience wasn't really my father. It was some fantasy version of him, a father who would be proud and present and emotionally available. And that person doesn't exist. Avery raised her champagne glass. Then here's to the people who do exist. The people who show up. The people who see you clearly and love you anyway. We clinked glasses, and for the first time that day, the bubbles actually tasted celebratory. Later, after Carmen had gone home and Avery was napping off the champagne, I sat in our apartment and stared at my phone. Gabriel's text was still there, with its casual cruelty and crying laughing emoji. I could call him. I could demand an explanation. I could tell him exactly how his absence had felt and insist that he acknowledge the impact of his choices, but I already knew how that conversation would go. He'd be sorry I was upset. He'd explain about the vacation booking timeline and the non-refundable deposits. He'd promised to make it up to me when he got back. He'd turn my pain into a problem to be solved with money, or gifts or grand gestures. What he wouldn't do was take responsibility for the pattern. He wouldn't acknowledge that this was just the latest in a series of broken promises. He wouldn't see that his absence wasn't just about missing one. ceremony was about a lifetime of teaching me that other things would always be more important than I was. For the first time in my life, I didn't want Gabriel's excuses or explanations. I didn't want to give him another opportunity to smooth things over with charm and deflection. I wanted something much harder to achieve. I wanted to stop caring whether he showed up or not. The weeks following graduation settled into a strange rhythm. I started my job at the crisis center, learning to navigate the complex emotional landscapes of people who'd been abandoned, betrayed, or forgotten by the systems and relationships that were supposed to protect them. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days helping others process their trauma while carefully avoiding my own. Gabriel texted sporadically from Bali, pictures of sunrise yoga sessions and elaborate breakfast spreads, accompanied by messages like, "Thinking of you," and "Can't wait to catch up when we're back." The exclamation points felt aggressive in their forced cheerfulness, like he was trying to emoji his way past the graduation situation without actually addressing it. I didn't respond to any of them. Carmen had found a box in the back of her closet. A collection of things from my childhood that she'd been saving for when I had my own place. Among the school art projects and soccer participation trophies, I found something that stopped me cold. A stack of birthday cards from Gabriel spanning from age 6 to 21. I spread them out on my bed like evidence in a criminal investigation. The pattern was immediately clear. For the first few years after the divorce, the cards were elaborate pop-up designs, musical chips, glittery details. The messages inside were lengthy, full of promises about special plans and upcoming adventures. Can't wait for our daddy-daughter weekend at the beach. From age 13, this year we're going to do something amazing for your birthday. Start thinking about what you'd like most. From age 15, as the years progressed, the cards became simpler. Standard Hallmark designs with pre-printed sentiments that Gabriel had barely modified. Hope your special day is wonderful. Another year older and wiser. Generic birthday wishes that could have been written to anyone, more telling than the cards themselves were the promises they contained. Handwritten commitments that I could now see had been broken more often than kept. Beach weekends that became lunch dates. Special birthday adventures that became gift cards delivered by mail. Elaborate plans that dissolved into last-minute cancellations followed by expensive compensations. I'd saved every card, I realized, because each one represented hope. Evidence that Gabriel was thinking about me, planning for our relationship, investing in our future connection. But looking at them now, they felt like a record of systematic disappointment dressed up in birthday wrapping. The worst part was finding cards I'd completely forgotten birthdays where Gabriel had made specific promises that I'd apparently blocked from memory when they fell through. My 18th birthday card contained plans for a weekend in Vancouver. Just the two of us to celebrate your becoming an adult. I had no memory of that trip, which meant it had never happened. How many disappointments had I absorbed and forgotten? How many broken promises had I filed away in whatever psychological drawer holds memories too painful to examine? I was still sitting with the cards spread around me when Avery got home from her internship at the women's shelter. She took one look at the scene and immediately understood what was happening. "Oh, honey," she said, settling down on the bed beside me. "Look at this one," I said, holding up the card from my 16th birthday. He writes about taking me to New York for a long weekend. Broadway shows, fancy dinners, making memories that will last a lifetime. I remember being so excited about that trip. I researched restaurants and bought a new dress. What happened? I have no idea. The trip just never materialized. But look at the next year's card. He references it like it actually happened. Hope this birthday is as special as our New York adventure. Like he genuinely remembered it differently than I did. Avery picked up another card, reading Gabriel's elaborate handwriting. "This is gaslighting," she said quietly. Not intentional, maybe, but functional gaslighting. He makes promises with complete sincerity, breaks them without acknowledgement, then references them later as if they'd been fulfilled. I never thought of it that way, but she was right. Gabriel's selective memory had trained me to doubt my own recollections of his absences. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe the trip had been postponed, not canceled. Maybe he'd suggested lunch instead of dinner, and I'd misremembered the original plan. "I think he believes his own stories," I said. I think in his mind, he really has been a consistently present father who occasionally has unavoidable scheduling conflicts. "That's even worse than conscious lying," Avery replied. "At least conscious liars know they're being dishonest." I thought about Gabriel's graduation text again. The casual way he'd referenced Sophia booking their trip months ago, as if that made it an unavoidable conflict rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize vacation planning over his daughter's milestone. "I used to think the problem was that he was bad at follow-through," I said. He had good intentions, but poor execution. "But that's not it, is it? No, babe." "The problem is that he makes promises based on how he wants to feel about himself. As a father, not based on actual plans to be present as a father." That distinction hit like a revelation. Gabriel wasn't failing to keep promises, he was making promises he had no intention of keeping because the act of promising allowed him to feel like a good father without doing the work of actually being one. My phone buzzed with another text from Bali. This time it was a video of Gabriel and Sophia snorkeling, both of them grinning at the camera underwater. The message read, "Paradise." Sophia says, "Hi, love you, sweetheart." I stared at the video for a long moment, watching my father's delighted face as he explored coral reefs while I processed the wreckage of our relationship 3,000 miles away. He looked happy, carefree, completely untroubled by the fact that he'd missed the most important day of his daughter's academic life. For the first time, I let myself feel angry about that happiness. Not just hurt or disappointed, but genuinely angry that Gabriel could be enjoying paradise while I was sitting in my childhood bedroom, examining the archaeological evidence of his paternal failures. "I'm done," I said suddenly. "Done with what?" "Done waiting for him to become the father I need him to be. Done making excuses for him. Done editing myself to fit into his limited emotional availability." I gathered up the birthday cards and put them back in the box. Not to save them, but to return them to Carmen. They belonged to my childhood, and it was time to stop living there. "What are you going to do?" Avery asked. "I'm going to stop responding to his texts, stop calling him on holidays, stop initiating contact and see what our relationship actually looks like when I'm not doing all the work to maintain it." It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. For 22 years, I'd been afraid that if I stopped reaching out to Gabriel, our relationship would disappear. But maybe it was time to find out whether there was actually a relationship there to disappear. And if he notices, if he asks why you've gone quiet, then maybe we'll have the first honest conversation we've ever had. But even as I said it, I suspected Gabriel wouldn't notice. He'd gotten comfortable with a relationship where I did all the emotional labor while he enjoyed the ego boost of having an accomplished daughter who adored him. As long as I kept sending updates and expressing interest in his life, he could feel like a connected father without actually having to connect Dot over the next few weeks. I tested my theory. Gabriel's texts continued arriving sporadically, more vacation photos, brief check-ins, promises to catch up properly when he returned. I read them all but didn't respond to any. Not out of spite, but as an experiment in what our relationship looked like when the communication wasn't entirely one-sided. The results were exactly what I'd expected and somehow still devastating. Gabriel never asked why I'd gone quiet, never followed up on unanswered messages, never called to check if something was wrong. He seemed perfectly content with a one-way relationship where he could perform fatherhood through text messages without requiring any response or engagement from me. 3 weeks into my communication break, I got a text that made me realize how completely Gabriel misunderstood our dynamic. Hope you're having a great summer, sweetheart. We're back from Bali next week, and I'd love to take you to dinner to celebrate your graduation properly. Let me know what works. He'd been gone for a month. I'd been radio silent for 3 weeks, and his response was to suggest dinner as if nothing had happened, as if his absence and my silence were just normal rhythms in our relationship. I showed the text to Carmen, who read it twice before shaking her head. "He has no idea, does he?" she said. "No idea that you're upset. No idea that his behavior has consequences. No idea that relationships require mutual effort." Should I respond? Carmen was quiet for a long moment. "What do you want, Mia?" Not what you think you should want, not what would be easier, but what do you actually want? I thought about it carefully. What did I want from Gabriel? An apology? An acknowledgement of the pattern? A commitment to change? Or did I want something simpler and more radical, the freedom to stop wanting anything from him at all? "I want to stop being disappointed by him," I said finally. "I want to stop hoping he'll be different and start accepting who he actually is." And who is he? Someone who loves the idea of having a daughter but doesn't want to do the work of actually being a father. Saying it out loud felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like landing on solid ground for the first time in years. Gabriel wasn't going to change. He wasn't going to wake up one day and realize that he'd been an absent father who prioritized everything else over his child. He wasn't going to apologize for the graduation miss or acknowledge the pattern of broken promises or take responsibility for the emotional labor I've been doing to maintain our relationship. But I could change. I could stop waiting for him to become someone he'd never been. I could stop performing worthiness for someone who would never be worthy of the effort. I could choose to show up for myself instead. It was Carmen who told me about the cancer, not directly and not intentionally. I found the medical records by accident while helping her sort through insurance. Paperwork for a claim related to her back injury from lifting patients at the hospital. A manila folder labeled BC treatment plan fell out of a stack of documents, spilling papers across the kitchen table. Breast cancer. Stage 2. Diagnosed 18 months ago. I sat in Carmen's kitchen, surrounded by chemotherapy schedules and oncology appointments and surgical consultation notes, trying to process the fact that my mother had been fighting cancer for a year and a half without telling me. The timeline was devastating. She'd been diagnosed during my junior year of college. The chemotherapy had overlapped with my spring finals. The surgery had been scheduled during my summer internship. All those times, she claimed to be working extra shifts. She'd actually been at medical appointments. All those times she'd looked tired and blamed it on long days at the hospital. She'd been recovering from treatments that were literally poisoning her system to save her life. "Mia?" Carmen's voice came from the doorway. She'd been in the garden, and her hands were still dirty from transplanting herbs. "What's wrong?" I held up the treatment plan with shaking hands. "When were you going to tell me?" Carmen's face went through several expressions: surprise, resignation, and finally a kind of exhausted relief. She sat down across from me and reached for the papers I'd spread across the table. "I wasn't," she said simply. "You weren't going to tell me that you had cancer?" I wasn't going to tell you while you were in school. I didn't want you to worry or feel like you needed to drop out to take care of me." The words hit like a physical blow. While I'd been stressing about graduation and Gabriel's attention and whether my achievements were impressive enough to earn love, Carmen had been quietly fighting for her life and protecting me from the knowledge that I might lose her. This is ... This is huge. This is life-changing. How could you not tell me? Carmen pulled off her gardening gloves and folded them carefully on the table. Because I know you, Isola. I know that if you'd found out about the diagnosis, you would have dropped everything to take care of me. You would have left school, moved back home, made my cancer the center of your life. She was right, and we both knew it. I would have abandoned my degree, my internships, my carefully planned future to be Carmen's caregiver. And she'd known that, so she carried the burden alone to protect my opportunities. But I should have been here, I said, my voice breaking. You shouldn't have gone through that by yourself. I wasn't by myself. I had doctors I trusted, friends from work who helped with appointments, a treatment plan that worked. And I had the knowledge that my daughter was pursuing her dreams instead of putting her life on hold for something that was ultimately my battle to fight. I looked at the paperwork again, noting dates and treatment schedules. Carmen had been getting chemotherapy during the week of my 21st birthday. She'd driven up to campus to take me to dinner, claiming she was tired from a difficult shift. At work, I'd been annoyed that she seemed distracted during dinner, that she didn't seem as excited about my birthday as I'd wanted her to be. She'd been literally fighting cancer, and I'd been upset that she wasn't enthusiastic enough about my birthday celebration. The surgery, I said, finding the date on one of the forms. You had surgery during my summer internship, a lumpectomy. Very routine. I stayed with Tia Rosa for a few days afterward. I called you that week, and you said you were working extra shifts. I was annoyed because you sounded tired, and I wanted to tell you about my project at the nonprofit. Carmen reached across the table and took my hands. And I loved hearing about your project. I loved knowing that you were having experiences and making connections and building the life you wanted. That gave me something to fight for. The generosity of it was overwhelming. While I'd been performing achievements to win Gabriel's attention, Carmen had been fighting cancer and finding strength in my successes. She protected my education, my future, my peace of mind, at the cost of going through the scariest experience of her life, essentially alone. Are you okay now? I asked, suddenly terrified that there might be current treatments I didn't know. About clean scans for 6 months, Carmen said. The doctors are optimistic. But yes, there are follow-up appointments, ongoing monitoring. It's not completely behind me. I thought about all the times over the past year when Carmen had seemed tired or distracted, all the occasions when I'd attributed her low energy to work stress or getting older. She'd been managing cancer treatments and recovery while maintaining her job and supporting my education and dealing with Gabriel's continued absence from both our lives. Does Dad know? I asked. Carmen's expression shifted slightly. I told him when I was first diagnosed. What did he say? He offered to help with medical bills if insurance didn't cover everything. He sent flowers after the surgery. There was something in Carmen's tone that suggested this response had been inadequate, but she was being characteristically diplomatic about Gabriel's limitations. But he didn't offer to be involved, to help with appointments or recovery. Gabriel doesn't do well with illness, Carmen said carefully. It makes him uncomfortable. He's better at grand gestures than daily support. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Gabriel's avoidance wasn't just about me. It was about anything that required sustained emotional presence. Carmen's cancer would have demanded exactly the kind of consistent, unglamorous support that Gabriel had never been capable of providing. "I'm so angry," I said suddenly. At me for not telling you, at him for not being here, for leaving you to handle this alone, for missing my graduation to go on vacation while you were recovering from cancer. Carmen was quiet for a moment. Gabriel doesn't know about the graduation timing and the cancer timing overlapping. He doesn't really keep track of medical schedules. He should keep track. He should know what's happening in our lives. He should care enough to ask follow-up questions and remember important dates and show up when things are hard. The anger felt clean and righteous in a way that my graduation disappointment hadn't. Gabriel's absence from my achievement was painful, but his absence during Carmen's health crisis felt morally inexcusable. "All those extra shifts you said you were working," I said, reading through the appointment schedule again. "Chemotherapy, radiation, recovery time, and some actual extra shifts," Carmen admitted. "Medical bills, even with insurance. I wanted to make sure your graduation dress funds stayed intact." That revelation was the final blow. Carmen had been working extra hours while fighting cancer to pay for medical treatments and still save money to buy me a beautiful dress for graduation day. Meanwhile, Gabriel had been planning a vacation to Bali. "I need to call him," I said. "Isola." No, he needs to know. He needs to understand what's been happening while he's been playing tourist in Southeast Asia. Carmen reached for my phone. "What exactly do you think that conversation will accomplish?" He needs to take responsibility. He needs to acknowledge that he's been completely absent during the most difficult period of our lives. And then what? He apologizes and promises to be more present. He sends a check to cover medical bills as a way of compensating for emotional absence. He makes grand plans to be there for future health scares. Carmen's questions cut straight to the heart of my frustration. Even if Gabriel acknowledged his failures, even if he apologized sincerely, even if he promised to change, what would that actually accomplish? It wouldn't erase the months when Carmen had faced cancer alone. It wouldn't change the fact that he prioritized a vacation over my graduation. It wouldn't transform him into the consistently present father and supportive co-parent I'd spent 22 years wanting him to be. "I just want him to know," I said weakly. "You want him to feel bad," Carmen corrected gently. "You want him to suffer some consequences for his choices. You want him to be forced to confront the impact of his absence." She was right. I wanted Gabriel to feel the weight of what he'd missed, the gravity of what he'd ignored. I wanted him to understand that his emotional unavailability had real consequences for the people who'd needed him. But Gabriel had spent years proving that he was incapable of that kind of self-reflection. He'd mastered the art of reframing his failures as unfortunate circumstances rather than choices. He'd probably find a way to turn Carmen's cancer into another example of how difficult and complicated life had been, rather than an opportunity, where he could have shown up differently. "What if," Carmen said quietly, "instead of trying to make Gabriel feel bad about not being here, we focused on the people who were here?" I looked at her across the table, this woman who'd fought cancer while protecting my education, who'd worked extra shifts while recovering from chemotherapy, who prioritized my graduation dress while managing medical bills. "You're here," I said. "I'm here. Avery's here. Professor Delaney has been here. She knew about the cancer, by the way. She's been checking in regularly. Tia Rosa has been here. Your coworkers at the crisis center have been here, even though you've only known them for a few weeks." Carmen was right. I've been so focused on Gabriel's absence that I've failed to fully appreciate the presence of people who'd actually shown up. While I'd been performing worthiness for someone who would never witness it properly, I'd been surrounded by people who saw me clearly and loved me consistently. "I'm sorry," I said. "For what?" "For not being here when you needed me. For focusing so much energy on Dad that I missed what was happening with you." Carmen stood up and moved around the table to hug me. "You were exactly where you needed to be. In school, building your future, becoming the woman I raised you to be. That's not something to apologize for." But I felt like it was. I felt like I'd been looking in the wrong direction for so long that I missed the real story of my life. While I'd been waiting for Gabriel to see me, Carmen had been seeing me all along. While I'd been hoping for Gabriel's approval, Carmen had been proud of me every day. While I'd been performing for Gabriel's attention, Carmen had been loving me without conditions or requirements. "The graduation dress," I said. "You bought it while you were dealing with all this." "I bought it because I wanted my daughter to feel beautiful on her special day. Because I wanted you to have something lovely to remember the moment when all your hard work paid off. Even though Dad didn't see it, I saw it," Carmen said simply. "I saw you walk across that stage, and I saw how strong and accomplished and beautiful you looked. That was enough for me. I hope someday it will be enough for you too." Looking at Carmen's face, tired but determined, worn by treatment but not broken by it, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in my life, I was angrier about Gabriel's absence from Carmen's life than from my own. His failure to support her during her cancer treatment felt like a bigger betrayal than his failure to attend my graduation. Maybe that was what growing up actually meant, not just becoming an adult yourself, but seeing the adults who'd raised you as fully human, deserving of support and care and presence in their own right. Gabriel had failed us both, but Carmen had never failed me. It was time to stop measuring my worth by the standards of someone who'd never learned how to love consistently, and start appreciating the love that had been constant all along. I'd been working on the same story for 3 years. It started as a creative writing assignment for Professor Delaney's advanced fiction workshop during my sophomore year. The prompt was simple: write about a character waiting for something that may never come. I'd intended to write about a woman waiting for a bus that had been indefinitely delayed, but somehow I ended up writing about a girl named Marina whose father kept promising to come home. The story had evolved over the years, growing from a 5-page short story into something that was trying to become a novella. Every semester, I'd return to it, adding new layers, exploring different angles, diving deeper into Marina's psychology as she constructed increasingly elaborate justifications for her father's absence. Marina's father was a traveling salesman who sent postcards from exotic locations but never managed to coordinate his business trips around school plays or soccer games. He was always about to visit, always planning to come home for holidays or birthdays, always one deal away from stability and presence. Marina spent her time creating detailed itineraries for imaginary visits, planning conversations they would have, rehearsing stories that would make him proud. The parallels to my own life were obvious to everyone except me. Professor Delaney had been gently encouraging me to examine why I kept returning to this particular story, what I was trying to work out through Marina's endless waiting. But I'd resisted the suggestion that the story was autobiographical, insisting it was purely fictional, a character study unrelated to my personal experience. Now, sitting in my childhood bedroom with Carmen's cancer records spread across my desk and Gabriel's vacation photos glowing on my phone screen, I finally understood what I'd been writing all along, a love letter to myself and a prophecy of my own awakening. I opened my laptop and read through the latest draft. Marina was 22 in this version, fresh out of college, still checking. her phone compulsively for updates from her traveling father. She'd gotten a job at a nonprofit organization, helping other people process trauma and abandonment, while remaining completely blind to her own patterns of emotional self-harm. The story was unfinished because I hadn't known how it ended. I'd been waiting for Marina's father to change, to show up, to prove that her years of patience and hope had been worthwhile. But fathers like Marina's fathers like Gabriel don't change because someone waits long enough or hopes hard enough or performs worthiness with sufficient dedication. They change when they want to change, if they ever want to change at all. I started typing a new scene. Marina stood in her mother's kitchen, surrounded by medical records she'd never seen before. Stage 2 breast cancer. 80 months of treatments. A year and a half of her mother fighting for her life while Marina had been away at college, obsessing over her father's latest postcard from Prague. She thought about all the phone calls where her mother had sounded tired, all the time she'd attributed that exhaustion to extra shifts at work instead of chemotherapy. She thought about her recent graduation, where she'd spent the entire ceremony scanning the audience for a man who was snorkeling in Bali, while the woman who'd raised her sat alone in the third row, cheering with a voice still hoarse from radiation. Treatments. For the first time, Marina understood the difference between love and performance. Her father loved the idea of having an accomplished daughter, but he never loved her enough to witness her accomplishments in person. Her mother loved Marina so deeply that she fought cancer in silence to protect her daughter's dreams. Marina closed her laptop and walked into the garden, where her mother was transplanting herbs despite hands still weakened by chemotherapy. She sat down in the dirt beside her and started helping, not because her mother needed the assistance, but because some kinds of love are expressed through presence rather than words. "Tell me about the treatment," Marina said. "Which part?"
"All
of it. I want to know what you went through. I want to understand what I missed while I was waiting for someone else to show up." I stopped typing and stared at the screen. This was how Marina's story ended, not with her father's return, but with her turning toward the love that had been constant all along. But my story wasn't finished yet. I picked up my phone and scrolled through Gabriel's text messages from the past month. Vacation photos, generic check-ins, the dinner invitation that ignored 3 weeks of silence. He was still performing fatherhood through social media updates and casual communication, still operating under the assumption that I would continue doing all the emotional work to maintain our relationship. I drafted a response to his dinner invitation. "Hi, Dad. I've been thinking a lot about our relationship since graduation, and I need to be honest about some things. I spent the ceremony looking for you in the audience, even though I knew you weren't coming. I've spent most of my life editing myself to fit into your limited availability, hoping that if I achieved enough or needed little enough, you'd eventually become the present father I wanted you to have. But I'm done waiting for that transformation. I'm done performing worthiness for someone who doesn't want to witness it consistently. I hope you had a wonderful vacation, and I hope Sophia enjoyed her birthday trip to Bali, but I need to step back from trying to maintain a relationship that has always been mostly one-sided. I'm not angry and I don't need anything from you. I just need to stop pretending that occasional attention is the same as actual connection." I read it 3 times before deleting it entirely. Gabriel wouldn't understand that message. He'd see it as manipulation or emotional blackmail. He'd respond with explanations about how busy he'd been, how much he loved me, how important I was to him despite evidence to the contrary. He promised to do better, to be more present, to make it up to me with something bigger and more expensive than whatever he'd missed, or worse, he wouldn't respond at all. He'd file my message under dramatic emotional outbursts and wait for me to get over it and return to our previous dynamic. Instead, I typed something much simpler. Thanks for the dinner invitation. I'm pretty busy with work right now, but I hope you and Sophia are settling back into Seattle life well. Polite, non-committal, offering nothing for him to argue with or explain away. I sent it before. I could overthink it. His response came within minutes. Of course, sweetheart. Let me know when your schedule opens up. So proud of everything you're accomplishing. Generic enthusiasm. No acknowledgement of the 3 weeks of silence. No curiosity about why I might be too busy for dinner with the father I'd always prioritized. No recognition that anything had changed between us, but something had changed, even if Gabriel couldn't see it. I'd stopped waiting for him to notice my absence, stopped hoping he'd ask the right questions, stopped expecting him to care about the details of my emotional landscape. I opened my laptop again and continued, writing Marina's story. The next time her father called, Marina let it go to voicemail. Not out of anger, but out of a simple lack of interest in performing her half of their familiar script. She knew exactly what the voicemail would contain: apologies for being out of touch, promises to visit soon, generic questions about her. Life that wouldn't require follow-up because he wouldn't remember her answers anyway. She listened to the message later, while cooking dinner with her mother. Her father's voice sounded exactly as it always did, charming, slightly distant, full of affection that felt more like habit than connection. He talked about his latest business trip, mentioned that he'd thought of her when he saw a bookstore. In the airport, promised to call again soon to catch up properly. Marina deleted the message without calling back. How does it feel? Her mother asked. Empty, Marina said, but also peaceful, like setting down something heavy I didn't realize I'd been carrying. I saved the document and closed the laptop. For the first time in 3 years, I thought I might actually be able to finish Marina's story, the real work. I was beginning to understand. It wasn't about getting Gabriel to change or acknowledge his patterns or take responsibility for his emotional absence. The real work was about changing my own patterns, stopping the performance, ending the pursuit, choosing presence over absence in my own life. Professor Delaney had always said that the best fiction comes from writing toward the truth you're afraid to face. For 3 years, I'd been writing around my own truth, creating fictional distance from the reality I wasn't ready to confront. But Gabriel's graduation absence and Carmen's cancer revelation had finally forced me to see what I'd been writing about all along. I'd been writing about myself. Learning to love myself enough to stop waiting for someone else to do it properly. My phone buzzed with another text from Gabriel. Sophia found the cutest little gift shop in Uba Drat. You back something special. Can't wait to give it to you. I read the message and felt nothing. No excitement about the gift, no gratitude for being thought of, no renewed hope that this gesture might signal a deeper change in his attention patterns. Gabriel had brought me a souvenir from the vacation he prioritized over my graduation. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I went to the garden to help Carmen with her herbs, sitting in the dirt beside the woman who'd loved me consistently for 22 years while I'd been looking elsewhere for validation. Tell me about the chemotherapy, I said. Carmen's hands stilled in the soil. Are you sure you want to know? I want to know everything I missed. I want to understand what you went through while I was busy performing for someone who wasn't paying attention anyway. Carmen began to talk about the fear and the treatments and the way her body had responded to the medications. She talked about the friends who'd driven her to appointments and the coworkers who covered her shifts and the moments when she'd felt most alone. She also talked about the things that had given her strength, knowing I was thriving at school. Hearing about my internships and grades and plans for the future imagining the life I was building for myself. "Your achievements weren't for your father," she said quietly. "They were for you. And for me because I got to be proud of the woman you were becoming." I thought about all the energy I'd spent trying to make Gabriel proud, all the ways I'd shaped my life around earning his attention and approval. But Carmen had been proud all along, not of my performance, but of my growth, my kindness, my resilience. Maybe it was time to start living for the people who were actually watching. The confrontation I'd been avoiding for 3 months finally happened on a random Tuesday in September. Gabriel showed up at my apartment unannounced, carrying a wrapped gift and wearing the confused expression of someone who couldn't understand why his usual charm wasn't working anymore. I opened the door to find him standing in our hallway, looking around at the peeling paint and narrow stairwell like he'd never seen student housing before. "Surprise," he said, holding up the gift bag with the kind of forced enthusiasm that immediately put me on edge. "I thought I'd drop by and finally give you your graduation present, and the souvenir from Bali, of course." I stood in the doorway without inviting him in, acutely aware that Avery was in the kitchen and could hear every word of this conversation. Gabriel seemed oblivious to the fact that showing up uninvited wasn't the gesture of spontaneous affection he seemed to think it was. "This isn't a great time," I said carefully. "Oh, come on, sweetheart. It'll just take a minute. I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for you to have time for dinner. Since you've been so busy with work, I thought I'd bring the celebration to you." He was using his business voice smooth, persuasive, designed to overcome objections through sheer force of charm. It was the same tone I'd heard him use on phone calls with difficult clients, and recognizing it in our conversation felt like a small betrayal. "Gabriel, I really can't. 5 minutes," he interrupted, already pushing past me into the apartment. "Just let me give you these things, and then I'll get out of your hair." And there it was, the pattern I'd been enabling for years. Gabriel making decisions about my time and space, then presenting those decisions as favors he was doing for me. He'd invited himself into my apartment, then framed it as respecting my busy schedule. I followed him into our small living room, where he was already looking around with the particular brand of judgment that wealthy people reserve for spaces they consider beneath them. Our secondhand furniture and makeshift decorations suddenly felt shabby under his scrutiny. "Cute place?" he said in a tone that meant the opposite. "Very ... student why?" Avery appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing her protective friend expression and holding a coffee mug like a weapon. "Hi, Mr. Morales." "Avery, good to see you again. How's the master's program going?" "Finished in May," Avery replied coolly. "Right around the time Isola graduated." The poignant reminder hung in the air between them. Gabriel's smile flickered slightly, but he recovered quickly, turning back to me with renewed enthusiasm. "Well, that's actually perfect timing because I have something very special for our graduate." He held out the gift bag with a flourish. "Open it." I took the bag reluctantly, aware that this moment was being choreographed for Gabriel's benefit rather than mine. He wanted to be the generous father bestowing gifts on his accomplished daughter. He wanted to perform parental pride and involvement, regardless of whether I was interested in participating in the performance. Inside, the gift bag was a jewelry box containing a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant shaped like a book. It was pretty expensive and completely generic, the kind of thing someone buys when they know their daughter is an English major but don't know anything else about her taste or personality. "It's lovely," I said, because it was, and because I've been trained since childhood to express gratitude for Gabriel's gifts regardless of the circumstances surrounding them. I saw it in a shop window and immediately thought of my literary daughter. Gabriel said proudly, And wait, there's more. He pulled out a small wooden sculpture, some kind of abstract carving that was clearly meant to be decorative. From Bali. The artist said it represents new beginnings and personal growth. Perfect. For a recent graduate, right? I held the sculpture, trying to find something meaningful to say about a souvenir from the vacation that had prevented Gabriel from attending my graduation. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. It's very thoughtful, I managed. I know. You've been upset about the graduation thing, Gabriel said, finally acknowledging the elephant in the room. And I get it, I really do. The timing was just impossible to work around. But I hope you know how proud I am of everything you've accomplished. Do I? The words came out before I could stop them. Gabriel looked genuinely confused. Of course. You do. I tell you all the time. You tell me yes. But do you know what I've accomplished? Do you know what my job actually involves? Do you know what I wrote my senior thesis about? Do you know what I'm hoping to do with my life? The questions seemed to catch Gabriel off guard. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly struggling to come up with specific answers. You're working at a crisis center, he said finally. Helping people, making a difference. What kind of crisis center? What population do we serve? What's my specific role there? Gabriel's confident expression was beginning to crack. Well, I'm not good with details, sweetheart. But I know you're doing important work. You don't know, do you? You don't know anything specific about my life. You know that I graduated from college and got a job that sounds meaningful, but you don't actually know what I do or what I care about or what challenges I'm facing. Avery had moved closer to the living room, clearly ready to intervene if this conversation went completely off the rails. But I felt calmer than I'd expected, like I was finally saying things I'd been thinking for years. That's not fair, Gabriel said, his voice taking on a defensive edge. I know you better than you think. I do. You're smart, you're creative, you're passionate about social justice. You've always been mature for your age. Independent. You get that from me, actually, that drive to succeed. His response was perfectly generic personality traits that could apply to thousands of college graduates, delivered with the kind of vague confidence that suggested he thought he was being specific. When's the last time you asked me a follow-up question about something I told you? I asked. What do you mean? I mean, when I tell you about my job or my life or something I'm working on, when's the last time you asked for more details? When's the last time you remembered something I said and brought it up in a later conversation? Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to recall examples of deeper engagement with my life. The silence stretched uncomfortably. I ask about your job all the time, he said finally. You ask if work is going well. You don't ask what I'm working on or what I've learned or what challenges I'm facing. You ask for a status update, not a conversation. Isola, I think you're being a little unfair here. I've been supportive of your education, your career choices. You've been financially supportive, I corrected. Sometimes, when it's convenient. But that's not the same as being emotionally present. Gabriel's face was flushing slightly, and I could see him struggling between his instinct to charm his way out of this conversation and his growing realization that his usual tactics weren't working. I love you, he said, as if that settled everything. You know, I love you. I know you love the idea of me, I replied. I know you love having an accomplished daughter you can mention at dinner parties. I know you love the ego boost of feeling like a proud father. But I don't think you actually know me well enough to love me specifically. The words felt harsh even as I said them, but they also felt true. Gabriel loved his concept of me successful. Low maintenance, gratefully accepting of his sporadic attention. But he'd never shown curiosity about who I actually was beyond those surface achievements. That's a terrible thing to say, Gabriel said quietly. Is it? Then prove me wrong. Tell me something specific about my personality that isn't a generic positive trait. Tell me about something I'm struggling with or excited about or working toward. Show me that you know me as a person, not just as your daughter, the English major. Gabriel stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to come up with specific examples of deeper knowledge about my life. The silence was devastating in confirmation all at once. I know you've been going through a hard time since graduation, he said finally. I know you're probably feeling pressure about starting your career and figuring out adult life. I know you're stressed about money and independence, more generic assumptions. Gabriel was describing the common experience of recent college graduates. Not anything specific to my actual emotional landscape. I wasn't going through a hard time after graduation, I said. I was excited about my job, confident about my future, proud of what I'd accomplished. The hard time started when I realized that the person I most wanted to share that pride with had chosen a vacation over witnessing my achievement. Gabriel winced. Sweetheart, I explained about the vacation. Sophia booked it months in advance. And we couldn't get refunds. Stop, I said firmly. Stop explaining. Stop making excuses. Stop pretending that this was about scheduling conflicts instead of priorities. What do you want me to say? I want you to take responsibility. I want you to acknowledge that you chose Sophia's vacation planning over your daughter's graduation. I want you to admit that this is part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. Gabriel was quiet for a moment, and I could see him weighing his options. Apologize and take responsibility, or continue defending his choices and risk further conflict. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry that the timing worked out the way it did. I'm sorry that you felt unsupported. I never meant for you to feel like you weren't important to me. Another non-apology that focused on unfortunate timing rather than deliberate choices. Gabriel was apologizing for my feelings without taking responsibility for the actions that had caused them. That's not enough, I said. What more do you want? I want you to understand that I'm done, I said clearly. I'm done trying to maintain a relationship where I do all the emotional work. I'm done performing worthiness for someone who doesn't want to witness it consistently. I'm done waiting for you to become the father I needed you to be. Gabriel's confident expression finally cracked completely. You don't mean that. I do. I'm not cutting you out of my life, and I'm not asking you to change. I'm just accepting who you are and choosing to stop wanting more than you're capable of giving. Isola, you're upset, and I understand that, but I'm not upset, I interrupted. I'm clear. For the first time in my life, I'm completely clear about what our relationship actually is, and I'm choosing to stop pretending it's something else. Gabriel looked around the apartment like he was hoping Avery might intervene, might tell me I was being too harsh or emotional. But Avery just stood there with her arms crossed, clearly supporting whatever I needed to say. I should go, Gabriel said finally. Yes, you should. He moved toward the door, then turned back one more time. This doesn't have to be permanent, you know. When you're ready to talk like adults, I'll be here. And there it was, the final condescension, the suggestion that I was being childish or irrational rather than finally being honest about our dynamic. Gabriel, I said, using his first name deliberately. I'm talking like an adult. Probably for the first time in our relationship. The question is whether you're ready to listen like one. He left without responding, taking his gifts and his wounded pride and his complete lack of understanding about what had just happened. After the door closed, Avery and I sat in silence for several minutes. "How do you feel?" she asked finally. "Empty," I said, but also ... finished. Like, I finally said everything I needed to say. "Do you think he understood any of it?" "No, but that's not my problem anymore." I looked at the necklace and sculpture Gabriel had left on our coffee table. Pretty objects that were supposed to represent his love and thoughtfulness, but that actually represented his inability to see me clearly enough to choose gifts that reflected my actual personality or interests. I'd keep them, I decided. Not because they meant something, but because they were perfect evidence of everything I just articulated about our relationship. Gabriel loved the idea of having a daughter, but he'd never loved me enough to learn who I actually was. Now, finally, I was ready to stop trying to teach him. 6 months later, I was sitting in Professor Delaney's office, discussing my application to the MFA program at the University of Washington. The creative writing portfolio I'd submitted included Marina's story finally finished, finally honest about what it had been exploring all along. "It's remarkable work," Professor Delaney said, flipping through the printed pages. The way you've captured the psychology of waiting, the self-deception involved in hoping someone will change. The ending feels earned rather than imposed. I'd been nervous about including such a personal story in my application, worried that admissions committees might see it as therapy rather than art, but Professor Delaney had encouraged me to trust my instincts, to understand that the best fiction often comes from mining our own emotional truths. "How does it feel to have finished it?" she asked. "Like closing a door I'd been afraid to shut," I said. "Like finally accepting something I'd been resisting for years." Marina's story ended with her choosing presence over absence, not dramatically, but quietly, by turning toward the love that had been consistent rather than continuing to chase the love that was conditional. It wasn't a story about forgiveness or reconciliation or dramatic confrontations. It was a story about a woman learning to value herself enough to stop performing for an audience that would never appreciate the performance. Gabriel and I hadn't spoken since his visit to my apartment. He'd sent a few texts in the weeks following our conversation, generic check-ins that I'd politely but briefly acknowledged. Eventually, even those had stopped. Our relationship had settled into exactly what I predicted, without my constant effort to maintain connection. There was no connection to maintain. It had been surprisingly painless. I'd expected to feel guilty or sad about our growing distance, but mostly I felt relieved. The energy I'd been spending on hope and disappointment and elaborate justifications for his behavior was now available for other things: my work, my friendships, my writing, my relationship with Carmen. Carmen's latest scans had been clear. 6 months cancer-free, with doctors optimistic about her long-term prognosis. She'd started taking art classes at the community college, pursuing the creative interests she'd set aside during my childhood. We had dinner together twice a week now, not because I felt obligated to check on her, but because I genuinely enjoyed her company. "Have you heard from your father recently?" Professor Delaney asked, as if reading my thoughts. "A few texts here and there. Nothing substantial. How does that feel?" "Peaceful, mostly. I keep expecting to miss him more than I do, but I think what I was missing was the idea of having that kind of father rather than the reality of the relationship we actually had." Professor Delaney nodded. "There's a difference between grieving someone's death and grieving the relationship you never had with someone who's still alive." She was right. I'd been grieving for months, but not for Gabriel's absence from my life. I'd been grieving for all the years I'd spent waiting for him to become someone he'd never been interested in becoming. "The MF program," she said, changing the subject. What are you hoping to get out of it? Time and structure to write seriously. Feedback from other writers. The chance to develop my voice without worrying about whether it's commercial or practical. And after that, I'd been thinking about that question a lot lately. For years, my future plans had been shaped around making myself impressive enough to earn Gabriel's attention and proud enough to justify Carmen's sacrifices. But with those external motivations removed, I was discovering what I actually wanted for myself. Teaching, maybe. Writing that matters to me. Working with people who've experienced trauma or abandonment. I don't need to save the world, but I'd like to do work that feels meaningful. That sounds like a life worth living, Professor Delaney said with a smile. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. The MFA program represented possibility, not the kind of achievement designed to impress other people, but the kind of growth that served my own creative development. On my way home, I stopped at the bookstore where I'd been spending most of my free time lately. The owner, an elderly woman named Ruth, had started letting me help with book recommendations and reading group selections. It wasn't paid work, but it felt like practice for the kind of literary community I wanted to be part of. How did the meeting go? Ruth asked when she saw me. Better than I expected. Professor Delaney thinks I have a good chance of getting accepted. Of course you do. Your story about the girl and her absent father, that's the kind of writing that stays with people. Ruth was one of the few people who'd read Marina's story in its final form. Her response had been immediate and emotional. She'd recognized something in Marina's experience that resonated with her own family dynamics. Do you think it's too personal? I asked. Too obviously autobiographical? The best fiction always is, Ruth replied. The trick is making your personal truth universal enough that other people can see themselves in it. I thought about that as I walked home through the familiar streets of my neighborhood. For years, I'd thought my experience with Gabriel was unique, shameful, something I needed to hide or overcome. But working at the crisis center and sharing my story with friends like Ruth had taught me that emotional abandonment was far more common than I'd realized. There were countless people walking around with the wounds of parents who'd been physically present but emotionally absent, who'd mastered the performance of love without learning how to actually connect, who'd trained their children to be grateful for scraps of attention. While other people got full meals. My phone buzzed with a text from Avery. Carmen made tamales. Come home hungry. I smiled, quickening my pace. This was what presents looked like, not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but tamales waiting at home and people who noticed when you'd had a big day and wanted to celebrate with you. When I got to the apartment, Carmen was indeed in the kitchen with Avery, the two of them laughing about something while music played from Avery's laptop. The scene was so warmly domestic that I paused in the doorway just to appreciate it. There she is, Carmen called when she saw me. How did it go with Professor Delaney? I filled them in on the meeting while we ate, describing the application process and the program requirements and my hopes for the next phase of my education. Both women asked thoughtful follow-up questions, remembered details from our previous conversations about my writing, showed genuine interest in my plans and concerns. This was what I'd been looking for all along, I realized. Not performance and applause, but presence and engagement. Not someone to impress, but people to share with. I'm proud of you, Carmen said as we were cleaning up the dishes. Not because of the MFA program, though that's wonderful. I'm proud of how you've handled this whole situation with your father, how you've chosen to focus on what you have instead of what you're missing. I had a good teacher, I said, hugging her, Later that evening, I sat down to write. Not Marina's story this time, but something new, a piece about a woman learning to appreciate the love that shows up consistently rather than the love that promises to show up eventually. My phone sat on my desk, silent. No text from Gabriel, no voicemails full of vague promises, no communication requiring careful management of his ego or my expectations. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't waiting for anything. I was just living, writing stories that mattered to me, building relationships with people who showed up consistently, pursuing goals that served my own growth rather than someone else's approval. It felt revolutionary and simple all at once. Gabriel was somewhere in Seattle, probably still telling people about his daughter, the graduate student, probably still believing that his sporadic texts and expensive gifts constituted a meaningful relationship. He might even miss me sometimes, in his limited way, but I'd stopped missing him. Not because I'd stopped loving him, but because I finally learned the difference between loving someone and needing them to love you back in ways they weren't capable of. I opened a fresh document and began typing. The woman in the garden didn't know she was being watched. She moved among the tomato plants with practiced ease, checking for ripeness, adjusting stakes, pulling weeds with the kind of careful attention that comes from years of tending the same small plot of earth. Her daughter watched from the kitchen window, marveling at the patience required for gardening, the willingness to plant seeds without knowing exactly what would grow, the faith that careful tending would eventually produce something nourishing. It had taken her 23 years to understand that love looked like this, daily. Unglamorous, consistent care rather than dramatic gestures or promises of future attention. She'd spent most of her life looking elsewhere for validation, missing the steady presence that had been there all along. I wrote until late into the night, crafting a new story about a different kind of love, the kind that shows up every day without fanfare, that tends carefully to growth without demanding applause, that creates safety through consistency rather than excitement through unpredictability. By the time I finally closed my laptop, I realized I'd written my way into something I'd been seeking for years, the understanding that I was already enough, already loved, already exactly where I needed to be. The story I had been waiting for someone else to write about my life had been mine to write all along. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.